The blood had already soaked into the roots before Nora saw the man. She had been crouching at the base of the limestone outcrop for the better part of an hour, her knife walking through a stubborn cluster of pale root near the stone, her satchel open on the ground beside her and half full from the morning's gathering. The light coming through the canopy overhead was still low and undecided, the particular grey gold of a morning that had not yet made up its mind about what kind of day it intended to become. She had been awake since well before the sun. She had walked the 2 miles from the settlement boundary in near darkness, along a path she knew by memory well enough to walk blind, because the pale root was always more potent after a cold night and Clara had asked for it before the week was out. When Clara asked for something before a particular time, she had generally already been waiting longer than she was willing to admit. The forest was the way it always was at that hour. Birds moving through the upper branches on their morning business. The occasional crack of something traveling far to the west, unhurried. Wind coming in low and thin and uninterested in what it was moving through. She paid the kind of attention she always paid when she was out here alone, not alarmed attention but the steady background awareness of someone who understood that this territory did not belong to her pack and that anything that happened to her in it was entirely her own problem to handle. She turned to move her satchel to a better position and the man was there. 30 feet across the clearing, pressed against the base of a fallen oak, one arm trapped beneath his own weight, his face angled into the back. The ground around him was dark in a way that ground was not supposed to be dark. She registered this, all of it, in the single moment before the moment broke apart into its pieces. She went still. Her knife was in her hand. She was aware of it in the specific way you became aware of things you were already holding when you suddenly needed to think about what you were holding. She counted to 3. She crossed the clearing. Up close, the wound was worse than the distance had allowed her to hope it might be. It ran from the top of his left shoulder down past his lowest rib, not a clean cut but a tearing, the kind of opening made by something with force and reach rather than an edge. The wound's lips had already begun pulling apart, the initial tension of impact relaxing and the torn tissue shifting, and the ground beneath him was not merely stained but soaked through, deep and spreading, the root-bound soil holding more of it than earth normally would. He had been lying here for some time. She did not complete the calculation of what some time meant in the specific terms of blood lost and how much blood a body could lose before the arithmetic became irreversible. He was breathing. She could see it in the shallow rise and fall of his ribs. That was the only number she needed right now. She moved without making the decision to move. It happened the way things happen when the body had already reached its conclusion and the mind was simply arriving to find it already made. Both palms came down flat against the wound, pressing the torn edges toward each other the way you pressed a split seam on something too important to lose. The warmth of the wound hit her immediately. She pushed the thought of it away before it could become something her stomach would have an opinion on, and she settled her weight forward on her knees and pressed. This was not enough. She understood that the moment she did it. She was not attempting to fix anything. She was trying to slow what was happening until something better could be arranged, and something better would require either her leaving to get it or someone arriving who could provide it, and neither of those things was available in this moment, which meant that in this moment this was the entire extent of what could be done. She pressed harder. He did not respond. He was unconscious in the deep way, far enough under that hands pressing against the wound of him did not reach the part that registered the external world. She looked at his face while she organized herself into a position she could hold. Large, in the specific way of a man whose body had done hard things across a long stretch of time, the density of real work rather than the bulk of effort for its own sake. His hands, the one visible against the root-covered ground, were scarred across the knuckles and across the heel of the palm. He wore a leather strap around his left wrist, plain, worn through at the buckle, the leather gone dark with old use. No markings she could read. No pack sigil on the leather or on what remained of his clothing, which the wound had largely claimed. The dark at the wound's edges concerned her most. She had seen that color once before. Clara's workroom, 3 years past, a horse with a rusted spike buried in its forefoot. Clara had worked on the animal for 2 hours without pausing, cleaning and packing and treating, talking steadily through what she was doing the way she always talked when she intended her apprentice to retain something. She had said, while her hands kept their rhythm, that the color at the wound's margin meant a compound had been left in it by whatever made it, something that did not belong to the wound itself, and that this compound was already working and would continue to work, and they could slow it but not stop it from the outside. The horse had died before the next morning. She looked at the edges of this man's wound and she pressed her hands harder, and she did not let herself finish the thought about the horse. She looked at the trees instead. She was in the neutral strip, the unclaimed buffer that ran between the south boundary of her park's land and the beginning of the northern territories. She came here 3 times a month and had done so for 2 years without incident. She knew the ground within a mile in any direction well enough to map it without thinking. She had never encountered another person here, never had cause to expect one. The neutrality of this place was, in her 2 years of experience, quite literal. She considered calling out. She considered what had made the wound. Something with the strength to open a man of this size from shoulder to rib in what must have been a single motion, because a man with this kind of build did not stand still for 2. Whatever it was had not stayed. It had passed through and gone, which was either considerably better or marginally worse than if it had stayed, depending on what through and gone actually meant in terms of distance. She did not call out. She inventoried what she had. A half-full satchel of pale root and sorrel, her knife, the jacket she was wearing, no fire kit because she had not anticipated needing one, no food beyond what she had eaten before dawn. She took note of this inventory with the practical part of her mind and set it beside what she needed and accepted the gap between them as the current condition of her situation. She pressed her hand steady and began to count. She had started counting as a child, in the years when waiting had no shape and needed to be given one. She counted to 60 and started again, the numbers moving through the back of her mind in a steady line while everything else ran in front of them. 20 minutes passed. 30. The birds were slow in returning, the way they were slow after something large had moved through and left its disturbance in the air. She tracked them with a small portion of her attention and kept the rest on the breathing and the wound and the trees. He was still breathing. She stayed. Around the 2nd hour she reached into the satchel with one hand and found the pale root by feel. She unwrapped a piece from its cloth and pressed the cloth against the lower edge of the wound where her left hand had been. Pale root was not the right tool for this. Clara would have said so without softening the assessment. The drawing compound in pale root worked on surface inflammation and on the slow spread of low-grade contamination in a fever. For a wound this deep and this complicated, proper treatment meant fire and thread and specific compounds she did not have. But what she had was real, and real was not nothing, and Clara had told her once, in the way she told her the things she most needed to retain, that the space between what you had and what was needed was where the actual scale lived. She held the cloth in place and brought her right hand back to the upper wound edge. She started talking. It began without intention, the way the crossing of the clearing had begun, and she found herself explaining the pale root, what it was and what it was used for, the way Clara prepared it for fever compresses, the difference in potency between root gathered after a cold night versus root gathered mid-afternoon in warm weather. She described the path she had been walking when she found him, how it had been disturbed, the animal scraping around the roots, why she had gone further east than her usual ground. She described Clara. Not in any formal way. In the small ways that were what she actually remembered. The 3 notes Clara hummed while she walked, always the same 3, not quite a melody but not quite not one either, simply a sound that meant she was focused and her hands were doing what they knew how to do. The arrangement of the jar cabinet, which Clara had never organized and Nora had organized within her first month and Clara had said nothing about for 4 months, and then said, one evening without looking up from her motor, that Nora's arrangement was less wrong than she had expected. The 3 cats, named Bitterleaf and Fenwick, and a third whose name Nora could never say without almost smiling, a small grey animal called Dustbin, who was the most aggressively affectionate creature she had ever shared space with and who had claimed her sleeping mat as his own preferred location within the first week. He breathed. She talked and pressed and counted. The sky clouded over around mid-morning without any particular announcement, the light going from the thin gold of early morning to a flat grey that meant the day had made its decision. The cold that came with the clouds was more serious than the morning cold had been. She pulled her jacket closer with one hand, then brought it back. The jacket was light, made for a walk and a morning's walk, not for sitting still on cold stone under clouded sky. She sat with the cold and treated it as a condition rather than a problem. She told him about the border park. Not the part she kept in the back room of herself, behind the door she kept closed. The front part. The river behind the settlement that froze reliably every winter, the children making their yearly arguments about whether it was thick enough yet. The year a boy named Peter had misjudged by a significant margin and gone through up to his waist and had to be pulled out by his older brother, who had told the story at every possible occasion for the 3 years it took everyone else to forget it and Peter to stop flinching when cold water was mentioned. She told about the autumn markets, the smell of the settlement in the 2 weeks when everything was being dried and packed and stored, that combination of late herbs and wood smoke and the particular quality of air that knew summer was done. She told about the path she had walked this morning, in the dark, 2 miles of familiar ground she could have covered with her eyes shut and had in fact done once when she was still new and had stayed at Clara's workroom longer than she meant to and walked home in a dark that was too complete for seeing. She did not tell him about the 2 years she did not look at directly. She talked around those places the way you walked around a spot in the floor of a house you knew well, without looking down, without drawing attention to the path your feet were taking. He breathed. She counted. She stayed. In the 3rd hour he moved. Not the significant movement of someone trying to get up, but the small involuntary shift of someone beginning to surface from a very deep place. His shoulder moved against the back of the fallen tree. His head turned a few degrees. The jaw tightened with the arrival of pain that was starting to find the nerve pathways back to consciousness. She said, quietly, "Stay still." The movement stopped. She took this as a sign worth taking. Some part of him, deep enough to function below thought, had heard the instruction and acted on it. She accepted this and kept her hands exactly where they were and went on. By the 4th hour her knees had entered a stage of complaint that required active management rather than passive acknowledgement. The stone beneath them was cold and uneven and the position she was in did not allow for any significant adjustment without shifting the pressure she was maintaining on the wound. She struck an internal bargain with her knees. She told them they were doing essential work and that she was aware of them and that she intended to address their concerns in full as soon as the current situation allowed. She did not move. She changed the pale root cloth and told him at more length about Bitter Leaf, the enormous orange cat on top of Clara's jar cabinet, the way his tail moved in sleep and sent things off the edge without him registering it. The morning she had arrived at the workroom to find an entire row of glass jars on the floor and Bitter Leaf still asleep above the empty shelf and Clara standing below him holding a broom with an expression Nora had learned to recognize as the one Clara used when she was preventing herself from saying exactly what she thought. He breathed. Around what felt like the 5th hour something moved in the west, not close, not loud, the kind of sound that could be a branch under animal weight or could be the branch itself finally giving way. She went still and looked hard at the tree line in that direction for 3-4 minutes. The birds did not respond. Whatever it was had either passed far enough out to be beyond their concern or was not what she was afraid it might be. She said, to the man, "We are fine." She was not certain of this. She said it anyway, because it was true in the ways that currently mattered and because she had been talking to him for 5 hours and it would have felt dishonest to suddenly stop when the subject was relevant to both of them. He breathed. Late in the afternoon he moved again, and this time it was different. His shoulder rolled. His arm came off the ground toward a bracing position. His whole body tilted with clear and specific intention toward upright, the movement of someone whose body knew what getting up felt like and was trying to do it. She was across him before she had the thought. Both arms came down across his chest and her weight followed without deliberation. Not hard. Not cruel. Enough. He was far stronger than her, she knew that even as she was doing it, felt it in the way his body resisted without particularly trying to. But he was half destroyed and deep in the confusion of someone who had been unconscious for most of a day and the damage was working against him as much as it was working against her, and she had gravity and she had position and she had the specific weight of someone who had been sitting in the same place for hours and had decided what she was willing to give up and what she was not. He went still. She felt his heartbeat under her left forearm. Fast. Not steady. Working very hard. She held the position for 10 seconds. Then she brought herself slowly back upright and put both hands back to the wound immediately. She said, in the calmest voice she could produce, you have a serious wound that I have been keeping pressure on since this morning. If you move, the wound opens further and I lose the pressure. I need you to stay still." A silence. Then his arm lowered. Slowly. Back to the ground. She exhaled through her nose. "Thank you," she said. She pressed her hand steady and watched the light through the branches go gold and thin toward evening and understood that the night was coming and she had not prepared for the night and she was going to have the night regardless. She stayed. Her name was Nora Vane. She was 23 years old. She had come from a border park small enough that the parks with real territory had never put it on their maps. She had no rank and no status and no particular history that would have mattered to anyone in this territory or north of it. She had a half-empty satchel and 2 hands and the stubbornness of someone who had decided that the version of herself who got up and walked away did not exist and had checked twice to be sure. She pressed her hands harder and let the gold light go. The night was the hardest thing she had ever done. She did it without deciding to, simply by not stopping, which was the way she had done most of the difficult things in her life. The light left without ceremony and she was in the gray that preceded real dark, and then in the dark itself, and the world contracted to the small circle of what she could feel, the wound under her hands, the back at her back, the cold walking through her jacket and finding the places it could reach. His breathing, which she had memorized across the day without meaning to, was what she navigated by. She counted it rather than seconds now because the breathing was the only number that actually mattered. She had no fire. She could not have made one. She had her jacket. She had the minimal warmth that came from his body, which was not nothing when you had been sitting in cold for 12 hours. She had the pale root cloths, fewer of them now than she would have liked, and she was changing them less frequently to preserve what remained. She talked. She described everything she could think of with the patience of someone who had nothing to do but give. The workroom by candlelight when Clara stayed late, the shadows the 2 flames made across the rows of jars. The names on all of them, every one, which she had memorized in the first month because the disorganization of the original arrangement had cost her 10 minutes every time she needed something specific. Clara had noticed the new arrangement 4 months after Nora made it. She had said, without looking up from the pestle, that Nora's alphabetical system was less inefficient than she had expected. Nora had understood this as the highest praise she was likely to receive on the subject and had gone back to what she was doing without making anything of it. She described the sound of the settlement at night in each season. Summer with its heat still in the air after dark and the insects working steadily. Autumn going quiet earlier each week. Winter with the specific silence of snow on the roofs and the extra weight of that silence, the way it pressed everything down into itself. Spring arriving not in a day but in a series of small daily arguments with the cold, winning 1 and losing 2 and then winning 3 in a row. He breathed. She counted. Around the deep middle of the night he groaned. A low, sustained sound with effort at its foundation, the kind that came when the body was trying to do something the mind had not cleared. She said immediately, steadily, "Still here. You are still here and you need to stay still." The groaning stopped. She said, softer, "I know it hurts. It is going to hurt for a while yet. But you only need to do one thing right now and that is stay still. That is the whole job." The silence. She felt the tension in him change, not releasing but redirecting, the way water redirected when it met a wall and found the path that ran alongside instead of through. She pressed her hand steady and counted and stayed. She allowed herself, in the deep part of the night when she had nothing else to do with the parts of her mind that were not occupied with counting and pressing, to think briefly about why she had not run. She had visited this thought a few times throughout the day, checking on it the way you checked on something stored in a place you were uncertain about. It was always the same shape when she found it. She had turned and seen the man and the wound and the blood and her body had moved before the argument could be made. There had been, at that moment, no decision. There had been a man breathing and her crossing the clearing toward him. She had not chosen to go. She had simply not chosen to leave, which was a different thing. She had spent 4 years choosing not to leave things. She noted this and set it in the back room with the other things she was not looking at directly, and she closed the door and went on. He woke in the hour before dawn. She knew it the exact moment it happened because the breathing changed. The deep unconscious rhythm dropped away and was replaced by something that had intention in it, someone returning from a long distance in a way that knew it was returning. When she could see his eyes in the gathering light of the sky above the trees, they were present and tracking. He looked at her. She said, before he could speak or try to move, "You are alive. There is a serious wound and I have been keeping pressure on it since yesterday morning. Please do not move." He looked at her for a moment. The confusion of a man first waking in an unfamiliar situation was not there. What was there was the assessing focus of someone who had been trained to understand quickly what situation they were in. He said, in a voice made rough by a day of disuse, "How long?" "A full day," she said. "Most of the night." He looked at the state of the light. At the trees. At her hands. He said, "You stayed." Not a question. A fact being placed in front of its own existence. "Yes," she said. He looked at her hands again. The skin across her palms had cracked in 2 places. The color was wrong throughout. She said, before he could comment on this, "My name is Nora Vane." A pause. "Kid," he said. "Just the one name." She pressed her hand steady and watched the sky go from gray to the pale washed color of almost morning, and she was still there, and he was still breathing. She had kept him through a whole night. She found this in the part of herself where things she had actually done lived, separate from things she had only considered, and she pressed on and let the morning come. The second day arrived gray and cold and uncompromising, the kind of morning that gave nothing away but gave you enough to work with. Nora was fully present to it. She had not slept. She was not going to sleep. The exhaustion she was carrying by this point had long since passed through the stage that felt like tiredness and come out the other side into something more fundamental, a low steady pressure distributed evenly through everything she was, like a sound held at exactly the threshold of hearing. She managed it the way she managed the pain in her knees and the persistent complaint of her hands, which was to register it, acknowledge its accuracy, and continue. She changed the pale root cloth against the wound's lower edge and was aware, as she unwrapped the next piece from the cloth in her satchel, that she was getting close to the end of her supply. She counted what remained. Not enough for another full day at the rate she had been changing them. Enough, if she was careful, for another several hours. She did not mention this to him yet. He was in and out in the early morning, surfacing and going back under in the alternating rhythm of a body that was using every available resource for repair and could not spare much for consciousness. When he came up he was quiet and observant, watching her hands and her face and the clearing around them with the attention of someone who gathered information completely before deciding what to do with it. She had the sense, watching him in these intervals, that silence was not a thing he performed but a thing he was, a fundamental quality rather than a choice, the mode of a man who had learned over a long time that words carried weight and he was particular about how much of that weight he spent. She talked during the periods when he was under, because the talking helped her maintain the specific kind of focus that sustained effort over a long time required. She went quiet when he surfaced, not because she had nothing to say but because the silence felt more honest when he could hear it. Around mid-morning, with the grey light having settled into its decision for the day, he asked how she had found him. She told him about the pale root patch, the disturbed soil, the animal scraping, why she had gone further east than her usual ground. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "You came here alone." "I always come here alone." "That is not wise." She thought about that for a moment. "It has been fine for 2 years. Yesterday it was not fine. Yesterday was not a situation I created," she said. A silence. Longer than the ones before it. She watched his face while it lasted and saw something there she could not name, something that moved through the still surface of him the way something moved through water when you could not see what was below. Then he said, "No. It was not." She pressed her hand steady. She said, "What made this wound?" He was quiet for a moment, making the same internal decision she had watched him make before he answered the question about how his pack tracked its members. "Something that should not exist in the neutral territory," he said. "Something that left a compound in the wound." "Yes." She nodded. She had been living with this knowledge since the first hour. It had not changed what she was doing, and it did not change it now. It simply confirmed that the treatment Cade would need when proper help arrived would need to include someone who understood the specific compound they were dealing with, and she hoped that such a person was available to his pack. She said, "Your pack will send someone when you stop moving." "They will have sent already," he said. "The moment I stopped moving, they sent." He paused. "We track each other." She looked at him. "How?" The corner of his mouth moved. The first thing she had seen on his face that was not pain or assessment. A long conversation for a better day. She accepted that. The morning moved. He surfaced and went under and surfaced again. She talked when he was under and kept her hands exactly where they were throughout. The pale root was running low. She was spacing the cloth changes further apart now, letting each one do more of its work before she replaced it. Around noon she reached the end. She unwrapped the last piece from the cloth in her satchel, pressed it into position against the wound's lower edge, and said, simply, "That is the last of the pale root. From here it is pressure only." He looked at her hands. She kept them where they were. He said, after a moment, "How long have you been doing this?" "Coming up on a day and a half." He was quiet. Then he said, in a voice that had the quality of someone keeping something carefully level, "You should have run when you found me." "Probably," she agreed. "I would not have known." "No," she said. "You would not?" The silence that followed was longer than the others. He said, "Why didn't you?" She had thought about what she would say when this question came, and she had prepared several answers, and none of them arrived when she opened her mouth. What arrived instead was the true one. "I don't have a clean answer for that," she said. "The honest version is that I looked at you breathing and I could not make myself into the kind of person who walked away from that. I tried the argument. It did not hold." He turned his head and looked at the trees. She watched his profile while he looked. He was thinking about something that was not available to her. She waited. After a while he looked back. He said, "When this is over, my alpha will want to know about you." She looked at him. "Is that a warning?" "It is information," he said. "What you do with it is your own decision." She thought about the weight of that sentence. About what it meant that an alpha she had not met, of a pack she could not name, would have an opinion about a healer's apprentice from a border settlement too small for most maps. She thought about what Cade might be in that pack, to make such a statement true. She said, "I will worry about that when it happens." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, small but real. "Most people," he said, "give a different response to that sentence." "What do most people say?" "Something that has more alarm in it." She kept her hand steady. "I have not eaten since the morning before yesterday," she said. "My knees are destroyed. My hands are cracking. I am down to nothing for the wound and I have been awake for a day and a half. I do not have room for alarm at the moment." The breath that came out of him was not quite a laugh but was in the same direction as one, a sound that had lightness in it, that came from somewhere the damage had not reached. It was brief. But it was there, and she took note of it the way she took note of the things that mattered. He said her name. Just that. Nora Vane. The way someone said a thing they were filing somewhere specific. "Yes," she said. She pressed her hand steady and watched the tree line and counted. The afternoon came in and settled and began its slow movement toward the light that meant the day was thinking about ending. She was managing 4 ongoing internal negotiations by this point, the knees and the hands and the hunger and the accumulated weight of no sleep, and keeping all 4 at the level of background noise rather than foreground required the specific kind of focus that left very little over for anything else. She talked when she had words. She counted when she did not. He drifted in and out. She tracked his breathing through both states, alert to any change in the rhythm or the depth. Around the 3rd hour of the afternoon he said, without preamble, "You have never done anything like this before." She looked at him. He was awake and watching her. She had not noticed the transition. "No," she said. "Clara is always 3 steps away." Who is Clara? My teacher. She paused. The healer I apprentice under. She has been teaching me for 3 years. She has never left me alone with something like this. Because she thought you could not handle it. She considered that. Because the opportunity has not arisen. She is thorough. She plans well. Things do not tend to go wrong in Clara's workroom. He was quiet for a moment. But this is not her workroom. No, Nora said. This is not. He looked at her hands on the wound. At the empty cloth in the satchel. At the state of her general situation, which she was aware did not look like anything a properly prepared healer would be caught in. He said, "You are doing better than most people would." She looked at him. "You have no basis for that comparison." "I have a significant basis for that comparison," he said. She was not sure what to say to that. She said nothing, and pressed her hand steady, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable the way silences sometimes were, but simply present. Around what she judged to be mid-afternoon, she became aware of the birds going quiet before she could have said she heard the thing that made them go quiet. She said, very quietly, "Someone is coming." He said, "My pack." He was awake, had been for the past hour, which she had tracked without letting on that she was tracking. How many? However many they determined was appropriate. She pressed her hands to full pressure and waited. They came out of the north tree line in a group of 6. Fast at first, then stopping completely when they saw her. She had a moment to register what she was looking at before the political architecture of the situation fully assembled itself in her understanding. These were not people from a small border settlement. The way they moved and the way they stopped had the quality of something organized around a certainty she had not encountered before, people who knew exactly what they were capable of and had never been in a situation that required them to be uncertain. One of the 6 came forward. Tall, gray in his temples, a scar across his left cheek old enough to be a different color. He looked at her hands. He looked at Cade. He looked at her hands again. She said, before he had the chance to speak, "The wound is dark at the edges. Something was left in it. I have been keeping pressure for a day and a half. He needs immediate proper treatment, starting with whatever addresses the contamination in the wound." The gray-tempered man looked at her for a moment. Then Cade spoke. 4 words. Low and clear and carrying the weight of a man who did not use the weight of his words for anything that did not need them. "Do not touch her." The clearing changed. It was not visible. She felt it like a change in pressure, the way the air changed before a storm arrived. The 6 adjusted, each of them, and she understood what she was seeing a moment after it happened. They were not moving toward her. They were positioning around her. She kept her hands on the wound. The woman with the healer's back crossed the clearing without rushing. She knelt on Nora's left side and began her assessment with short, precise questions, asking and listening and asking again, with the efficient focus of someone who had been doing this longer than Nora had been alive. She asked about the treatment, about the pale root, about what Nora had observed of the dark edging and when it had first appeared and whether it had changed. Her eyes went to Nora's hands twice during the exchange. The second time they stayed for a moment. Nora answered everything directly and without embellishment. The healer said, "We are going to transfer the pressure. Follow my instructions exactly." They worked together for several minutes. Nora followed the healer's directions with the focus of someone who had been running on focus for 36 hours and was not going to let it slip now, her hands moving where they were told to move, the pressure staying even through the transition because her hands had learned the weight of what they were doing and knew it without being told. When the healer told her she could lift her hands away, she did. She looked at her palms. The gray-tempered man was crouched in front of her. She had not noticed him crossing the clearing. He had come to her eye level the way someone did when they wanted to be certain they were understood. He asked about the treatment. She told him. He asked where she was from. She told him. He asked about the sequence of events, what she had found and when and what she had done. She described everything directly. He listened with the complete attention she had seen in Cade and was beginning to understand was characteristic of the people she was among. When she finished, He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Our Alpha is coming. He was 2 days north when we received word. He will be here tonight." She understood what 2 days north and arriving tonight meant in terms of pace and intent. She said, "All right." He nodded once and stood. The healer wrapped her hands with a competence that was its own form of communication. The compress had something in it that made the worst of what her palms were reporting go quieter. She flexed her fingers and found them moving with something closer to their normal range. She sat back against the fallen tree. She watched Kate's packmates walk the clearing with the quiet efficiency of people who trusted each other and had done difficult things together for a long time and did not need words to coordinate. She watched Kate being moved carefully to the shelter they assembled at the clearing's edge. The healer said, without ornamentation, that he was going to be all right. Nora exhaled. The amount of herself she had held in against that outcome left all at once, the way I left a room when a window opened, simply going. She sat with what remained, which was the cold and the hunger and the specific weight of everything her body had been asked to do, and she did not move from the base of the fallen tree. She waited. She had nothing else she needed to be doing. She had been here for a day and a half. She was going to see it through to whatever it became. She waited. He came with the dark, the way everything that day that was worth noting had come with it. The birds went silent first. All of them, all at once, a cessation so complete it had a sound of its own. Then the wolves in the clearing went still, that specific quality of stillness she had first observed when his packmates arrived, but more absolute now, with a depth and completeness she had not felt from them before. It was the stillness of people organized around something that had just arrived, the way iron filings oriented themselves around a magnet, not through any instruction but through the simple fact of what the magnet was. She was sitting at the base of the fallen tree, her back against the bark, her wrapped hands on her thighs. The healer had suggested, twice, that she move somewhere more comfortable. The first time, Nora had not moved. The second time, she had said that she would stay where she was for now, and the healer had accepted this without pressing it further, which Nora had appreciated. She was not sure why she needed to stay at the base of this particular tree. She was not sure it was entirely rational. She was going to stay here anyway, until whatever needed to happen happened. She had eaten, finally, a small piece of hard bread that one of the packmates had pressed into her hand without ceremony. She had eaten it with the focused attention of someone receiving something significant, slowly, tasting all of it. She had been watching the north tree line since the light went. He came out of the dark without announcement. She had expected to feel the moment he crossed from the trees into the clearing the way she had felt it when his packmates arrived, that change in the air. She did not. He was simply inside the clearing where he had not been a moment before, as if the line between being outside a space and being in it did not apply to him in the same way it applied to things with less gravity. The clearing organized itself around him. This was the only way she could describe it. The packmates did not move, not obviously, but something in the positioning shifted, the way a room of people shifted when the person the room was organized around arrived and made the organization visible. He crossed the clearing and the path he took was direct and without detour. He crossed directly toward her. She watched him come. He was tall in the way she had been half prepared for and in a way she had not been at all. It was not the height that registered first. What registered first was the quality of how he moved, a complete absence of anything that was not in service of getting from one place to another, no performance in it, no awareness of being observed. He was not old but he was not young either, and his face had the look of something that had been through a long time and had come out of it knowing more and spending less on what it knew. He stopped in front of her. He crouched. She had been sitting against a fallen tree for the better part of 2 days and she had expected him to look down at her. He came to her level instead, deliberately, without making anything of it, and she noted this detail the way she had been noting things all day without letting herself examine what she was doing with them. He looked at her. He did not rush this. He took in her wrapped hands, her ruined clothing, the specific state of her face after 2 days on cold stone with no sleep, the satchel beside her with its empty interior, the bark of the fallen tree visible behind her. He was reading the situation the way Clara read a wound, not just the visible surface but what the visible surface indicated about everything below it. He took a long time. Then he said one word. Why? Not a sentence. A single word, already stripped down to the center of the thing, the setup and the context removed. She had been preparing an answer for this conversation for most of the afternoon. She had thought about saying something practical. She had thought about framing herself as a healer's apprentice who had done what her training required. She had thought about the measured, professional presentation of events that left at the parts that were harder to explain. She opened her mouth. The true answer arrived before the prepared one. Because he was still breathing when I found him, she said. And I did not want to be the reason that stopped. The clearing was quiet. He looked at her with an expression she did not have a reference for, something outside the range of what she had learned to read in people over 23 years of paying attention to them. After a moment he said, "The healer tells me you use pale root on the dark edging." It was what I had. She says it may have slowed the spread considerably. She looked at her wrapped hands. She thought about the cloth she had pressed into position through the night, without certainty that they were doing anything, pressing them anyway. I knew it was better than not trying, she said. That was the extent of my certainty. He said, "The healer does not make that kind of assessment unless she is certain of it herself." A pause. She is rarely certain. She met his eyes. I did not know if it would work. I knew doing nothing was worse. Something moved through his expression. Brief. Small. Gone before she could identify it. Your answer just now, he said. About why? Most people, when they explain why they have done something, are also explaining something about themselves they want me to understand. She looked at him. What was I explaining? That you did not choose this, he said. That it happened before the choice could be made. That is a different kind of honesty than most people offer. She was quiet for a moment. I did not think of it as honesty, she said. I thought of it as accuracy. He was quiet for a moment in return. Then he said, "Kate told me something when I arrived." He had just woken up. "He told me you said he was not allowed to die." She had said that twice. Both times in the dark, in the low private voice of someone talking to themselves as much as to anyone else. She had not thought he was close enough to the surface to hear her. "I meant it," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what I cannot put down." He stood. Not abruptly. Completely, the way a man stood when he had finished one part of a thing and was moving to the next without leaving anything behind in the first part. He looked down at her from his full height, and she looked up at him from hers, and there was a long moment in which several things happened in the air between them. None of them were spoken. None of them were small. She was not sure exactly what they were yet. She was going to think about that later, when she had the space for thinking. He said, "You will come north with us." She registered the space around that sentence. The room in it for a different answer. She said, "For how long?" "That is a conversation for after your hands have been properly treated and you have slept." He paused. Both of which need to happen before most other conversations. She looked at him. He looked back. The look was even and unhurried and carried no pressure that she could feel, which was itself a kind of information. She said, "All right." He did not change expression. But something near his eyes shifted, the very edge of a shift, one step before something warmer. She said, "I don't know your name." He said, "Aldrich." One name. The same as Kate. She thought about asking for more and decided she would not. She said, "Nora Vane." He said, quietly, "I know. Kate told me." He held out his hand. She put her wrapped hand in it and he brought her to her feet with a care that was completely deliberate, all of his attention on her hands, on the way her knees moved as she straightened, on the full accounting of what her body had been through over 2 days. She stood. Her knees gave her a complete and detailed account of everything they had done. She stood anyway. The pack was already moving, the clearing being systematically cleared of the shelter and everything that had been used in it. Cade was ahead of her on the light frame, carried by 4 of the largest of the packmates with the careful coordination of people who understood the cost of doing it badly. The healer fell into step beside Nora without comment. The grey-tempered man nodded once as she passed him and she returned it. She walked north, into the dark of a forest she had never been in, with people she had not known 2 days ago, toward a place she could not name on any map she had ever studied. She walked. Her satchel was on her shoulder. The Sora was still inside it, tied with string, gone soft from 2 days of neglect but still probably good enough to be useful if it was treated promptly. She would find a way to get it to Clara. She would write a letter. The letter was going to require more honesty than she generally trafficked in, but that was a problem for later when she had slept and could think in full sentences. Clara would be annoyed. Then she would not be annoyed. Then she would have 17 questions that were really 14 questions and 3 observations she had already made independently but wanted confirmed. Nora knew how to answer all of them. She walked. She found herself watching the back of Aldrich's head at the front of the group, the way he moved, the way the group organized itself around his movement without discussion or adjustment, the way water found the natural shape of the space available to it. She was building a picture of him from pieces. The one word. The crouch. The space left in the sentence for a different answer. The way he had looked at her hands first and her face second, which told her something about what he considered most important to know. She did not yet have enough pieces to know what the picture was of. She was going to find out. She walked. Cade, on the frame ahead of her, turned his head slightly. She saw the movement before she understood its intention. Then his hand came back, not reaching for anything in particular, not reaching for her specifically, simply back, toward the space behind him where he knew she was walking. She looked at his hand. She did not take it. But the something that happened in her chest in that moment was specific and warm and the kind of thing that was going to matter later, when there was space for the things that matter to settle into their proper places. She walked. The trees came in closer as they moved north and the path narrowed and the clearing was long behind them. The dark was still deep but she could feel, in the quality of the air ahead of her, that it was a deep that had an end to it, that the dark was already beginning, in the slow way it always began, to consider letting go. Nora Vane, from a pack too small for any map that mattered, who had never done anything that would find its way into a story, walked north into the middle of one. She had nowhere else she needed to be. She had stayed. And staying, it turned out, had been everything. The entire thing. The whole of what was required and the whole of what had brought her to this path, to this dark, to these people, to the name she had just learned and did not yet know the full significance of. She had found a man breathing. She had kept him that way. Her hands ached underneath their wrapping and her knees were going to need a long conversation with someone who knew what they were doing, and she was hungry in the deep way that came from going without for too long and then beginning to process that going without all at once. She was warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. She walked. The forest thinned as they went, the path widening, the trees moving apart in the way trees moved apart when they were approaching something more open. She could feel the change before she could see it, in the way the air moved differently, the way the cold had more room to come from. She walked through the thinning trees and out the other side. The sky was wide above her. She had been under the canopy for 2 days. The sky was larger than she remembered. She walked under it and did not stop. The roots in her satchel could wait. The letter to Clara could wait. The 17 questions and the 3 observations and the conversation about what came next could all wait. Right now she was walking north, with her ruined hands at her sides and the cold night air moving against her face, and the dark ahead of her was already starting, in the way it always eventually started, to become something else. She walked. She had stayed when she could have run. She was not going to regret it. She was already not regretting it, and the not regretting had a specific warmth to it that she was not going to examine too closely right now, because examining things too closely was how you talked yourself out of them, and she was done talking herself out of things for the time being. She walked north. The sky above her was full of stars, more than she could see from inside the forest, and they were there and they were clear, and the dark between them was not empty but full of the kind of space that made things feel possible rather than simply large. She walked. The settlement Nora had left behind was 12 houses and a workroom and a communal hall that doubled as a meeting place and a storage building on the bad winters when the root cellar was not enough. It was the kind of place that could disappear from the world without anyone north of the border knowing it had gone. She had understood this from a young age, not with resentment but with the clarity of someone who has taken an accurate measurement and knows what the number means. She had grown up inside a number like that. She had learned to take up exactly the space available to her and no more. She had never understood until this morning, kneeling on cold stone with her hands on a stranger's wound, that taking up exactly the space available to her and no more was a choice she had been making without knowing she was making it. She thought about this in the hours she was not thinking about anything else. Which was not many hours. But the thought was there when she came back to it, the same shape every time, waiting for her to do something with it. She filed it with the other things she was not looking at directly and went back to counting. By midday of the first day she had been outside in the same place for longer than she had ever been outside in the same place before, which was a small and specific kind of record that no one would ever know about except her. She had also been alone in a way she rarely was, the deep aloneness of someone who had chosen, through inaction, to be responsible for something that was beyond the scope of what she was supposed to be responsible for. This aloneness was different from the aloneness of the walk to the neutral territory, which was simply the absence of other people. This was the aloneness of the only person who knew something that mattered, and who was going to have to carry it until they could hand it off. She was used to carrying things alone. That, she supposed, was something. She changed the pale root cloth and told him about the path from the settlement to the border, the way it felt underfoot in each season. Muddy in early spring. Hard and smooth in summer when the sun had been at it long enough. Covered in fallen leaves in autumn, which muffled your footsteps in a way that was pleasant unless you were trying to hear what else was moving. Icy in winter in the specific way of a path that had been walked by many feet, the surface polished smooth, which was beautiful and also extremely inconvenient. He breathed. She counted. She had not brought water. She had not brought water because she had not expected to be out past noon. By the late afternoon of the first day the thirst had made itself known in the way thirst made itself known when it had been waiting politely for several hours and had run out of patience. She registered it and put it in the back room with everything else and kept her hands where they were. She thought, not for the first time, about the decision that had not felt like a decision. About the moment she had turned and seen him and the moment her feet had started moving. She had always thought of herself as someone who thought before she acted. Clara had said, in the first month of the apprenticeship, that Nora's instincts were good but that she slowed them down by thinking about them, and that the work would get better when she learned to trust the instinct without making it wait for the permission. Nora had taken that instruction seriously but had not been entirely sure what to do with it in practice. She looked at her hands on the wound. She supposed this was what to do with it in practice. She pressed harder and kept going. On the morning of the second day, between the time the birds came back and the time Kate surfaced from the deep repair sleep his body kept pulling him into, she had her first full understanding of what she had done. Not in the sense of understanding it emotionally. She was too tired for that and the emotion of it was in a room with the door closed the same as everything else. In the concrete sense of knowing the fact of it. She had been here for over a day. She had not moved her hands except to change the pale root cloth and to stop him from getting up. She had not slept. She had not eaten since the day before she found him. She had talked herself hoarse and then gone quiet and then started again. She had told him more about her life than she had told most people she had known for years. She had kept him alive. She was reasonably certain of this. She was reasonably certain that without her hands on that wound through the night, the outcome would have been different and the different outcome would not have been good. She sat with the fact of this for a moment. It did not feel like what she had expected it to feel like. She had expected, if the moment ever came, to feel something large and named. She felt instead something small and specific and very quiet. The way things felt that were simply true. She pressed her hand steady and watched Kate begin the slow, blinking return to the surface that meant his body was ready to surface for another stretch, and she said, before he could say anything, "Good morning. You have been asleep for most of an hour. The wound is stable." He looked at her for a moment with the specific look of a man revising his understanding of a situation. He said, "You're still here?" "Yes," she said. "I am still here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nora Vane." "Yes." He said it the way he had said it the first time, like he was testing the weight of it. Like he was confirming that the name was real and that the person attached to the name was real and that both of them were actually in this clearing on this morning, which he was apparently still in the process of fully accepting. She understood the feeling, she thought. She was also still in the process of fully accepting that she was here. She kept her hands where they were and let the morning be what it was. When Kate's packmates arrived and she heard the 4 words he said to them, she did not look at his face. She was looking at the gray-tempered man's face, at the moment when what Kate had said registered, at the specific change that moved through the clearing afterward. She was watching this because she needed to understand what it meant, what the territory was that she had just been placed in without asking to be placed in it. She was still trying to understand it when Aldrich arrived. She was still trying to understand it when he crouched in front of her and said the one word. She understood it better, she thought, after she had given him the true answer rather than the prepared one. Because the way he received the true answer told her things about him that the prepared one would not have. The prepared one would have given him something to evaluate. The true one gave him something to recognize. There was a difference. She felt this too, in the part of herself where she put the things she was going to need later, and she stood when his hand came down to help her stand, and she walked when the pack walked, and she carried the empty satchel and the soft sorrow and the full weight of 2 days on her hands and her knees and her back, and she was more awake than she had been in longer than she could say, despite the fact that she had not slept in 2 days. She was walking north. She had stayed when she could have run, and staying had brought her here, and here was more than she had left behind. She walked. The stars above the thinning trees were the same stars that were above the settlement, 12 houses and a workroom to the south. They did not care about the distance. They were there the same way they were always there, the same as they had been when she was 8 years old looking up at them from the bank of the frozen river, and the same as they would be when she was much older than 23 and had done things she could not yet imagine. She walked under them. She was going to be all right. She was, she thought, already all right. She had stayed. There was a period in the deep hours of the first night when she was not sure she was going to make it to the morning. Not in any dramatic way. Not because she was in danger or because anything had changed in the wound or in his breathing. Simply because the body, when it has been pushed past its ordinary limits for a long time, sometimes sends up a clear and simple report that it is approaching the edge of what it can do. She received that report around the 13th hour and she sat with it. She thought about what would happen if her hands gave out. If the cold got into her fingers past the point of function and her grip went and the wound opened wider and whatever slim margin of survival she had managed to maintain closed over completely. She thought about this possibility with the flat, practical attention she brought to difficult facts, not flinching from it but not amplifying it either, simply holding it steady and seeing it clearly. Then she flexed her fingers one at a time, checking the degree of sensation and grip remaining in each one, and determined that while the situation was not good it had not yet reached the point of crisis, and that she had probably several more hours before it would. Several more hours was enough. She only needed to last until someone came. She pressed her hands back to full pressure and started talking again. She talked about the first real lesson Clara had given her, not the practical lessons that came in the first week when there was so much procedural knowledge to absorb that you could not yet see past it, but the first lesson that had been about something more than procedure. It had been 6 months into the apprenticeship. She had been preparing a compress and Clara had been working at the opposite bench and she had made a mistake in the preparation, not a dangerous one, simply an inefficient one, and Clara had noticed it and said, without looking up, that Nora was trying to make the thing perfect instead of making it useful. And when Nora had asked what the difference was, Clara had said, still without looking up, that perfect was a concept you apply to the idea of a thing and useful was a concept you apply to the actual thing in front of you, and that one of them helped people and the other one didn't. She had thought about that distinction many times since then. She thought about it now, with her imperfect hands on an imperfect wound in the middle of the night in a forest she did not own, and she thought that she was doing the useful thing and not the perfect thing and that this was correct. She pressed harder. She told him about the first fever patient she had treated without Clara in the room. A child, 7 years old, the youngest daughter of a family who lived at the north end of the settlement. The fever had been manageable, not the dangerous kind, but Nora had not known that yet. She had known the child and the parents, and she had known that she was the one who was here and that Clara was not, and that the difference between those two facts was going to have to be bridged by her and her alone. She had done everything correctly. The child had been fine. Clara had told her afterward, with the specific brevity she used for important things, that the treatment had been good. She had not felt the relief until Clara said that. She had been holding it without knowing she was holding it for the entire duration. Then Clara's words had arrived and the relief had come out all at once, which had been embarrassing, and Clara had pretended not to notice, which was one of the kindest things she had ever done. She thought Cade was probably something like that child. Not that he was a child, clearly. But that the relief of someone telling her he was going to be all right was going to arrive in the same way, all at once, after she had been holding it without knowing she was holding it for the entire time she had been here. She was prepared for that. She pressed her hand steady and counted and talked and stayed. The morning of the second day had a quality to it that the morning of the first day had not. It was not a better quality necessarily. It was simply different. On the first day the morning had been the light after a dark she had walked through to get here, the ordinary morning of the ordinary world going on around what she was doing. On the second day the morning was a different thing. It was the morning after a night she had been present for in a way that was not ordinary, and the light of it had a weight to it, an accountability. It was morning that knew what had come before it. She sat in it and let it be what it was. He was awake for longer stretches by mid-morning. The in and out quality of the early hours gave way to something more sustained as the day went on. He was in pain. She could see it clearly now that he was present enough for it to register, not the dramatic performance of pain but the contained variety, the kind that lived in the jaw and the set of the shoulders and the particular economy of movement of someone expending as little as possible because every expenditure cost something they could not fully replace yet. She said, at one point, I would give you something for the pain if I had something to give you. He said, I know. I'm sorry. He looked at her. Not the look that dismissed an apology because it was unnecessary. A different look. He said, you have given me everything you had. She met his eyes. Everything I had was not very much. He said, slowly, from where I am sitting, it was exactly enough. She looked at his chest rising and falling. At the wound, stable under the last of the pale root cloth. At the morning light coming through the trees at the angle it came through when the day was past its first quarter. She said, not yet. Ask me again when your healer gets here. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, all right. That was all. 2 words. But the 2 words had something in them that the other words in the conversation had not quite had, a settling quality, a weight that was different from the weight of endurance and was closer to the weight of trust. She pressed her hand steady and counted. She was very tired. She was also, she thought, more awake inside the tiredness than she had been at the start, when she was simply running on her ordinary energy and her ordinary caution and her ordinary sense of what she was and was not capable of. Something had shifted in the night, in the long hours of counting and talking and pressing. She was not sure what to call it. She was not sure it had a simple name. She stayed. When the gray-tempered man looked at her hands and the healer wrapped them and the pack moved around her with its quiet efficiency, she watched all of it with the open attention of someone who was learning something significant and knew she only had a short time to learn it. The way they communicated without speaking. The specific hierarchy of who moved first and who waited and who made the calls that the others acted on. The way the gray-tempered man positioned himself between her and the tree line, which she was not sure he was doing consciously but which she was quite sure he was doing. She fired all of it. She was going to need to understand these people. She was going to be among them for a while. She could feel that in the way you felt the shape of things before you could see them clearly. When Aldrich arrived and crouched in front of her and said the one word, she was ready. Not for the word itself. She had not known it was going to be one word. She was ready in the sense of being in the right position to receive whatever came, which was the readiness that came from having done everything she could do for a very long time and having arrived at the end of the doing. She gave him the true answer. She watched him receive it. She stood when he helped her stand, and she walked when the pack walked, and she carried her satchel and her Sora and her 2 days of everything into the dark of the forest going north. Kate's hand reached back. She looked at it. She almost took it. She did not, and the almost was real and specific and warm, and she walked north with it sitting in her chest like an ember that has not yet decided whether it is going to go out or grow, and she thought that either way she would be all right. She was already all right. She had been all right for a while without knowing it, which was perhaps the most useful thing the last 2 days had given her, beyond the obvious things, the survival and the stable wound and the name she had just learned. She walked north. The stars were above her. The dark was going to end, the way dark always ended. She walked. She thought about the gray-tempered man as she walked, about the way he had crouched in front of her and asked his questions. She had answered them all and he had listened to all the answers with the complete attention she was beginning to recognize as the characteristic quality of this pack, the quality of people who had never learned to half listen because the things they listened to had always mattered fully. She had not asked his name. She thought about this and decided she would ask it when the right moment presented itself. There would be a right moment. She had learned, in the past 2 days, that most things she needed had a moment if she waited for it rather than reaching for it too early. The healer walked beside her in the easy silence of someone who had already taken the full measure of the situation and had said everything that needed to be said about it. Nora was glad for the silence. She had been talking, or counting, or both, for most of 2 days, and silence was something she had developed a new appreciation for in the abstract while simultaneously needing to feel it. She let it be. She thought about the letter she would write to Clara. She ran through it in her mind the way she planned everything she needed to do carefully, in order, with nothing skipped. She would explain what had happened and where she was. She would say that she was well, which was approximately true. She would describe what she had done and why, which was harder to write in her head because the why still did not have a clean shape. She would tell Clara about the pale root cloth and Clara would want to know which batch she had used and whether the cloth had been the coarse weave or the fine and what color the dark edging had been at the margins when she first applied it. Clara was always most herself when there was something to analyze. She would also be worried, which she would express by being more precise than usual and asking more questions than usual and not saying anything directly about the worry. Nora knew how to read those questions. She would answer each one exactly and in the order Clara asked them and by the end Clara would have the information she needed to stop worrying and would be able to stop. She would also want to know about Aldrich, eventually. Nora was not sure yet what she would say about Aldrich. She looked at the back of his head at the front of the group. He moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who knew where they were going and did not need to consult anything to know it. The pack moved around him in the easy way of long practice. No one was watching him the way people sometimes watched authority, with the mixture of anticipation and anxiety that came from not knowing what it would do next. They simply moved with him the way things moved with things they had learned to trust. She thought about what trust looked like when it was that complete. When it had been built over enough time that it did not need to announce itself anymore. She thought about the 4 words Cade had said when his packmates arrived, and about what it had meant for them to hear those words, and about the immediate change in the way they held themselves toward her. She thought about the space Aldrich had left in the sentence. She filed all of it and kept walking. The forest ahead of them was thinning in the way that meant they were approaching something more open. She could feel it in the quality of the air, which had more room in it, and in the sound of the wind, which was coming from a direction that meant there was less between her and it than there had been. She was ready for something more open. She had been inside the canopy for a very long time. The trees thinned and the sky widened above her and the stars were everywhere, more of them than she could have seen through the canopy, and she looked up at them and kept walking and let herself, for the first time in 2 days, feel the full size of what had happened. It did not knock her down. It settled into her instead, the way things settled that were true and would stay true, and she walked under the white sky and let it settle and did not try to make anything of it yet. She was 23 years old. She came from a place small enough to be invisible on every map that mattered. She had done something in a forest in the neutral territory that she had not been trained to do and had not planned to do and had done anyway because the version of herself that did not do it did not exist, and she had been looking for that version for 2 days and could not find it. She was walking not under the stars with people she had not known 2 days ago. Something was beginning. She could feel the shape of it the way you felt the shape of a thing in the dark before you could see it, by where the space ran out and where it stayed open. Something was beginning and she was walking into it. Her hands ached and her knees ached and she was the hungriest and most tired she had ever been in her life, and she was more awake than she had been at 23 or perhaps at any age, and she walked, and the path went north, and the stars were everywhere. She walked.